and thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am so excited to be chatting with Jevan Soo Lenox, Chief People Officer at Insitro. Jevan had seen it all, formerly serving as CPO for household names like StitchFix, Minted, and BlueBottle. As someone who has really been in the trenches, I want to dig into what truly sets the greatest people leaders apart and what a better person to have that dialogue with. So, Jevan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Rasika.
I'm so excited. Well, this idea of good versus great is something I've really been thinking a lot about. And so I'm curious, maybe to start, what do you think differentiates the strategic approach of the top 1% of people leaders compared to others? Like, do you think there's an overarching theme that sets that 1% apart? And if so, what do you think that is?
I was thinking about this question, and I think the really, really exceptional people leaders that I've gotten a chance to meet and learn from or work for, they they really deeply understand the business strategy
Mm-hmm.
and anchor there first, and then think about how do I translate this into supporting people strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are a lot of actually very good people leaders who think about general people strategies and translating the rationale for them into kind of business stuff, right? So we're always told, hey, think about translating into business ROI and so
Mm-hmm.
on, right? But it's actually still kind of saying like, well, here are the people things that you're supposed to do, and then just make it, make a business case for them. Versus, I think, starting from like, where is this business now? Where are we trying to get it to? And thinking deeply about what are the people and organizational challenges and opportunities that will really unlock that business strategy, which I think actually makes or actually means choosing things, making trade-offs, and not actually always doing, sort of the things that everyone else is doing. So that willingness to kind of anchor there and to make different choices, I think creates exceptionalism.
Totally. And I think it also just ties so well too into this theme that, a lot of people leaders think about of how do we get a seat at the strategic table? Sometimes there's this stigma against, okay, HR is touchy feely. How do we get that strategic seat at the table? Just like the CFO does or the CRO does. And I think everything you just shared, like we can really lead by, putting these two things together. And so I'm curious, if you are a CEO and you are, trying to hire your next people leader and you're looking to evaluate talent coming in, how do you look for, exactly everything you just shared?
Yeah, I would interview those people leaders as if you were interviewing a more general business executive. So, of course, you would ask a bunch of questions about what they did in the function and things that they achieved and so on, right? But I would really sort of test their understanding of the businesses that they've been in.
Mm-hmm.
What really drove them? What were the business goals and so on? And again, I think that interview will actually, if sort of just listening in, you wouldn't necessarily know as a head of people interview,
Yeah.
right? It would be kind of like, oh, maybe they're hiring a marketing person, or maybe they're hiring an operations person, because it would just be
Yep.
a more general business conversation that would then say, okay, well, then tell me about the things that you and your team did to really unlock that success.
Yeah, absolutely. As you are building out your own team as a people leader, I'm just curious to what degree you look for that at various levels of your org. Like, is that kind of a non-starter for you at the director level, at the HRBP level? Like, to what degree do you coach and kind of train your HR hires on this business acumen versus look for it, knowing that, it isn't something that, people have always kind of grown up
Yeah.
incorporating. So yeah, where's the coach versus, you have someone coming in the door that has this skill?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and an annoying answer is it's both.
Mhm.
So I think it comes in two sort of flavors. The first is coaching people who've more grown up within the people function historically to have this business understanding and have this acumen. The thing that's really hard, and I'm really empathetic for people who have grown up in the function and get this advice to be more business savvy, business centric, and so on, is unfortunately the way the people function is constructed is it really holds people back from that, right?
Mm.
You're very focused on functional work. Maybe the HRBP role, I think, gives you the most exposure to that because of the conversations that you tend to have with business leaders and so on, right? But even then, it's like, you often are only getting the call when people are fighting and things are going badly and so on, right? I think more forward-thinking business leaders have their HRBPs actually join regular staff meetings just to listen into business context and so on, right? But not everyone does that, and also not everyone has time for it all the time, right? So some of that has to be about exposure and coaching, to your point, and really being deliberate in exposing your team to those things, right? So one of the things that I do, always actually done with my directs at the last sort of several companies I've been at, is I'm constantly bringing business strategy documents and presentations and conversations from the executive team to my directs. My current team, I jokingly call it, kind of Jevan's pop quiz, because I'm currently at a machine learning drug discovery company, which many things there I don't really deeply understand, but I actually have to take relatively complex strategic conversations around which therapeutic areas we might focus on in the future, or which parts of our technology platform we're going to build out versus not build out to really drive scientific success in our drug discovery and so on. And if it weren't for me sort of taking that time, many of those leaders just wouldn't literally have access to that information and so on. So it's really important to make space for that and time for that and answer questions. Actually, it's really good for me, because it forces me to sort of say, what do I understand? Ooh, I actually don't feel like I'm explaining this that well. I'm going to go back and ask, for clarity and make sure I kind of really deeply understand it as well. And then I've really sort of encouraged my team members to bring that curiosity to their cross-functional relationships. We have a wonderful leader at Insitro named Aj, who, he and I have monthly time, and we go through the normal things that one would sort of go through and related to his team and supporting him and his leaders. But we, sometimes we have time left over. And so we started this thing where I would take portions of scientific deck that we present to the board or maybe to the company that his team has done a lot of work on, and I actually present it to him. To be clear, I usually get through like maybe 2.5 slides before I kind of break down. But each time he's like, "Oh, that was pretty good. So here's how to explain this part. This is what this means," and so on. And I get another slide in. So now I can, probably after 3 years, can maybe present like 8 slides, right? And it's not. I'm never going to be leading neuroscience, to be clear. But it is a way for me to leverage my peers. And, here's the thing. Generally, if you're selecting well on companies that have good cultures and great leaders, people like to teach, right? People like to feel helpful. People are proud of the work that they've done, right? And so I just encourage people not to be scared to say, "Can I take you out for coffee? Explain. I heard about this at an all hands, or I saw this. Like, explain that to me. I really want to understand that." People really, I think, really respond to that in a really wonderful way. So it also deepens your relationship while actually increasing your business strength as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so many nuggets in there that I love. I love the idea of kind of teaching back. They say that's the best way to,
Right.
learn or retain something or learn it, solidify it. So I love that. But then also coupling that with the curiosity of, putting yourself in a position where it isn't your area of expertise, but you're curious and you're trying to absorb something that will round you out as a leader and better understand your company. So I love all of that. In terms of, we talked a lot about people leaders being business leaders. In terms of this idea of innovation and being on the cutting edge of everything that's new, what do you think some of the top 1% of people leaders do to innovate as it relates to, recruiting, talent development? What are they doing differently? Is there anything you've seen particularly out of the box that you've done or you've seen another company do really well that's interesting?
Yeah. So I think one of the things over time that I have been appreciative of is humans are humans, and the things that tend to motivate them, the things that tend to drive them to join, to stay, and so on, are actually relatively consistent over time. They're actually relatively consistent across cultures, they're relatively consistent, across different industries and so on, right? But the way that they manifest are quite different, right? So when I was leading BlueBottle coffee versus leading Insitro, so baristas, people devoted their lives to coffee in many cases, and my time in Insitro, machine learning, lab biologists and so on, right? On the face of it, these are radically different people. The vast majority of people at Insitro have PhDs, right? Just very different contexts. At BlueBottle, we actually had all sort of all walks of life of people kind of found their way to coffee. But when you really talk to people about what they what made them join the company that I was at and what made them stay, they're sort of remarkably similar themes, right? They wanted to join a company where they really believed in the mission and the product. They wanted to join a place where they just liked the people that they get to work with, and day to day that, sort of held consistent. Managers mean a lot. They generally, not always actually, but generally want to feel like there's a path to progress. They're getting feedback, right? So these are, not rocket science to your listeners. But the context is quite different, right? At BlueBottle Coffee, we had better attrition on an annual basis than, many sort of fast casual, fast food places, right? But you're still talking about 50% attrition maybe, right? In a given year, right? Like it's just, that's the nature of hourly. And so what do you build in that context around learning and development and career progression or so on, right? The flavors of that look quite different than what you build at a sort of very scientific, highly kind of technical place. But the core problems are actually the same. So all that is context of when I sort of come to think about who's innovating really well. I think the danger is getting sort of sucked up in just like the face of the fad, right? It's sort of like, what's the problem underneath that is actually often like a universal, timeless kind of problem. What's kind of been interesting to me, which is, maybe again, not a surprise, is after the perks war of the last kind of 10 to 15 years, underneath that, first of all, the perks war is receding, just given the markets have changed. But also I think just what's come back to the fore again is people really care about development. Right? People really care about progression. People really care that they have a manager who is, helping them succeed and get better day by day. And, I think there's been, research in the last few years on this, you can like literally monetize that. People like will take a pay cut or choose a lower offer because they feel like they actually have a better ability to progress in one organization versus another, a development culture, whatever it may have, right? So then if you think about that context and you think about, okay, well, what with new technologies and new ways of thinking, can you push the envelope on that problem versus, pay for people's dry cleaning or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. It's annoying to talk about it, but we should talk about it, right? Generative AI, there's a lot that's, sort of getting floated around right now in development and coaching. I think it's super early innings. A lot of it still feels a little bit like vaporware, to be honest, but you sort of glance at it and you're like, this 100% is coming, right?
Sure.
And how do you think about sort of architecting that around these technologies as they kind of evolve? My head of people and organizational development was playing around the other day. She's actually a certified coach, so she was a very successful coach before she came kind of in house, and so probably may have a natural just a little bit of skepticism. Was like, oh, this is a craft, right? And so on, right? And she was playing around the other day and actually just sort of I think it might have been OpenAI or either that or Claude, but was really sort of saying like, oh, I had this kind of challenging cross-functional interaction. Like I'm gonna have this coach me and see how it goes, and it actually wasn't bad, right?
Yeah.
So. Now, again, I think there's just all these secondary effects you have to think about, right? Because there is the piece of what people are receiving in terms of, kind of service provided, which is like, coaching for everyone has long been this mantra, right? That people are like, how can you do that? Whether it's through a vendor or whether potentially it's through generative AI. Yeah. But I think there's also this piece historically of development and, receiving coaching or whatever it is, where people feel, kind of seen and feel special, right?
Yeah.
And I actually think there's a danger of sort of being like, oh, technology just democratizes, give it for everyone, and you actually lose a little bit of that connection piece, and people sort of feeling like, wait, I'm not a cog in this machine.
Yes.
Like you see me, Rasika, you see me, Jevan, and my potential, and you actually care, right? And how do you maintain that emotion, right? Because I think that's actually the thing that makes people stay.
Right.
And I don't know if you get that emotion if you just get a, all you can eat pass to AI coaching land, right? And so there's interesting questions that I think are good ones to have. I'd really rather a world where technology enables much more access, but the connection piece is always going to be something that we have to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think really good people leaders, it's not necessarily a list of things, but you have to kind of look into the future and see like what's the hole that's going to emerge, and then how do I kind of fill that gap. And so with all this stuff with AI, I mean, there are the aspects of our roles that, that's not the muscle we're going to be flexing every day, but then now there are new things that are going to kind of emerge, and how do we then, differentiate our value? So I think that's a really good example. Switching gears to more of the internal team dynamics as a people leader, I'm sure you're in the middle of, different types of conversations, sometimes, even disagreements. And so particularly when tensions or conflicts arise, when you think of, like really top people leaders, what do they do exceptionally well when navigating those situations? Driving to solutions, maintaining alignment, while also ensuring that, voices are heard and you're driving to the best solution.
I think one of the biggest challenges for people leaders is you often have to both be a facilitator and actually have a point of view and have a skin in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really, really tricky balance.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't, not necessarily have a sort of silver bullet to this, but I think, kind of awareness is half the battle, right? So just understanding that you have those two roles to play. And if you come in all in on your thing,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's very well founded and so on, right? And you may not get sort of everyone there along with you, right? But if you are a pure facilitator, people often sort of be like, you're supposed to be the expert. Like, what's your point of view on this, right? And so I think one thing that I found to be helpful in that balance is to actually be very explicit of those hats that you're
Mm-hmm.
playing,
Mm-hmm.
and I even kind of sort of show that in the work or say it out loud and so on, right? And so for a while actually here at Insitro, when we had sort of more complex organizational decisions, I didn't go kind of all in Amazon, but I did kind of like write basically a memo,
Mm-hmm.
and the memo would sort of play out all the pieces, right, and all the perspectives, and kind of do the facilitator thing. And then I would actually have a point of view. It's like, this is my point of view. I'm not saying it has to be this, though I do have a strong perspective. And
Sure.
here's why, and let's go through it. And that, I think that explicitness, that it's like I'm responsible for both, and I'm showing you both cards like on the table,
Mm-hmm.
very explicitly, and also really kind of talking through the principles of how you're thinking about the problem at hand. One of the things I've often found that happens around, particularly around people and organizational issues, when people have conflict around decision making and so on, is you're just arguing about kind of the end point,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really talk through the principles.
Mm-hmm.
And two things can happen, right? One is you can talk through the principles and find that there's more alignment on the principles than you thought, and then that helps you get to better alignment at the end point. Or you find out, oh man, we're actually very deeply misaligned on principles, but then you have to start there. If
Mm-hmm.
you're just arguing about the vehicle at the end, and you're underneath all of that, you're like, wow, like you have a deeply different view on incentive compensation,
Mm-hmm.
which is a common one, right? Than I do, or the
Sure.
CEO does, right? Like, we can argue all day about the bonus plan, but that's actually not helpful. Like, we should get back to this point of like, do you believe in like radical differentiation or not, and why, and
Mm-hmm.
what is underneath that, and spend time there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is that, as you are considering new opportunities, like what are some of the things that, are like table stakes that you're like, or how should someone think about the things that are table stakes where they're like, this is core to my value set, and I, have always done things this way, so I'm going to filter out organizations that operate this way, versus things like, I don't know, maybe the example you shared on the differentiation comp, maybe that was something you did at one company, and the new company that you're considering does it differently. How should you think about the things that are foundational to your belief set versus, yeah, you try a different strategy and see if it works?
Oh, such a good question. I I think you have to be careful about bright line litmus tests, because also it's not, at a static moment in time, the way the company sort of feels at that moment, the way the CEO sort of shows up in the moment, like things change, boards have influence on a bunch of things. Like, so there's just a bunch of variables that you may not ultimately have control. I mean, you won't have control over,
Mm-hmm.
and also just things change, right? So I generally join really high growth, dynamic companies, and so the beauty of that is it's super exciting and never gets boring and so on. The
Sure.
hard part is it's always changing, and
Yeah.
so things that you thought were to be universally true in the beginning, like, don't always end up kind of being there. So I think it comes down to again, really thinking about the principles behind what matters to you, right? Like I probably am a little bit askance at like radical compensation differentiation,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not to say like you know, have never done a bonus plan or have never, right? That's like, like I think there's, many sort of shades of gradation in between. But I would say the most extremes of those where it's, I think they tend to become like mercenary cultures and,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit all in for yourself and so on, right? Like, I'm just like, yeah, like I'm not going to thrive there because
Mm-hmm.
that's not how I'm wired. Could I, sort of just intellectually do it? Maybe, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
like, my heart's not going to be in it, right? And like, candidly,
Sure.
like the people who tend to thrive those cultures probably aren't going to really work well with me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, right,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be talking about intrinsic motivation and
Yeah.
all these other things that need to be kind of part of the package. And so I think I would, I would sort of think of it less as, let me ask you, like, how do you think about your compensation plan? And how do you think about your DI programs? Another
Mm-hmm.
interesting topic these times, right? And more around how is the company thought about this topic, just generally, like what are the principles behind that and so on? What are the hard decisions that you've made so far around these things and what like underlay those decisions? This is a lot of what I interview the CEO on. So I do what I call reverse interviewing with the CEOs that I work with. Early on in my career, when I had much less power and much less of a reputation, you kind of only get a couple of questions at the end of interviews, maybe at the end of the process, right? But over time, I realized, wow, these questions really matter, and I can ask them at different points in the process. I can ask them all at the end if that's, sort of I need to have an offer in hand before they will give me that space. Or sometimes actually it's a little bit more even footed in the beginning, and I actually ask a bunch of questions, but they're basically interview questions. So I interview the
Mm-hmm.
CEO around decisions that they've made, mistakes that they've made. I ask them about the rest of the team, the exec team, and why they hired them, and how what's their take on their different strengths and challenges, and so on. And it's, what's interesting also is like some CEOs respond really well to that, which
Mm-hmm.
like kind of I think forecasts what that working relationship will be like, and some
Yeah.
actually do not take well to it at all. They're
Yeah.
like, I'm interviewing you. You're trying to get a job here, and I'm like, wow, this is how it's going to be. So if you're not into this, you definitely don't want me.
Yeah, yeah. That's so interesting also because I like that it, rather than just showing you what the current state is, like how have they evolved to get there? How do they think about things? Are they, strong opinions loosely held or whatever these different
Totally.
archetypes are? Like how do they adapt to the needs of the market, the needs of the business, all of these different things. So I think that's so interesting. Well, as I think about your background, what I love is you've worked at so many different types of industries, so many different types of companies. You're such a learner. You've always shared, you do everything you can to really understand the business so you can make the maximum impact. But beyond that, are there any specific practices or feedback loops or routines that, you have or, you feel like top people leaders have to continue to stay on top of their game and continue to grow and evolve?
Yeah. So I can tell you what I wish I did, and then I can tell you what I actually do. I deeply admire, people in my network who seem to always have read the latest book
Mm-hmm.
and are, super tuned in and, are, totally leaned in on the newest technologies and so on. And I just do not have the life space for it. Like I'm just
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm like, how do you do this? Like, are you
Sure.
reading past midnight every night? And
Audiobooks on like 4x. I
yeah,
don't
hundred
know. Yeah.
percent, exactly. And then even then, my children would probably make me change it to the Wild Robot soundtrack, which is like my Spotify number one on Wrapped today,
Love
based
it.
on
Love it.
that. And so what I've learned for me is that I have to learn through other people around me, right? So, sort of example I gave was learning through my peers
Mm-hmm.
around about the business. So it's not just me sort of being like, oh, I'm going to go read a bunch of docs at midnight, 10 o'clock every night to try to get the speed. There is some homework, right? Like I have to do some of that,
Mm-hmm.
but also that I can say like, oh, I'll actually take space out of my meetings and interactions and grab a coffee and grab a lunch and so on, and create learning through that. Um, on generative AI, there's a person on my team who is really, we've really positioned him to be a significant change agent across our organization as well as on the people team around thinking through where these technologies best plug in and how to really sort of raise people's acumen and embrace of them in the organization. And I think I had to come to peace with. I was like, oh man, I want to know all the things, and I want to be messing around with all those things, and so on. But I think the next best thing and the more realistic thing, given the way my sort of time is organized, is to really be partnering with him
Hmm.
and for him to teach me, actually, right? Of sort of saying, like, okay, how do I think about this question? Or how do I think about this? He's like, great, I experimented with this last week and so on, right? And it's just it's a different way of approaching the problem. But I think for many of us who just, constantly feel like you're behind, it's probably a little bit more of a realistic one.
Yeah, and I think that's great because people, it's almost like a curation. People that know you well, they know where your strengths are and how you can continue to optimize on some of those things or where maybe your blind spots are and fill in those gaps. So I think that's great. And also, I think another reason why a lot of companies are maybe thinking about return to work, like you just have that opportunity, people around you to kind of, guide you and mentor you, and you get that exposure. So I definitely understand some of the benefits of that. Well, I guess to wrap, one thing that I really enjoyed you sharing on a previous panel that I heard you on, I think the question was, what was the moment that made you feel most proud? And you answered that, at one of the companies you were at, you saw an employee many, many years later, and they said, Jevan, everything you built is still there. Like everything you built, we still use it. And I think that's awesome. And so I just wanted to ask, what do you think sets the top 1% of people leaders apart when it comes to leaving a lasting legacy in their organization or, building these programs that are built to last? Like it's so hard when things are constantly changing depending on the
Yeah.
size and stage that you entered. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two things. So the first is you really have to build a bench of leaders that are really, converts to the cause, right? Of, this is how we want to approach this for the organization. This is what we want to take forward. And I say that not just building a bench within the people team, although that's clearly important, but actually building a bench across the organization, right? Of just, sort of enlightened managers and executives and so on that really buy in and really want this to be how this kind of company operates. So naturally, then it becomes much bigger than you and your time there, but is kind of living on and being passed on and so on. The other thing I think is really important to think about, I'm going to sound like a one track record, principles, because it's very hard, actually, I think, for programs, to your point, to live on forever. I often say that one of the hardest things about building in high growth companies is you have to build a program knowing that, probably within 18 to 24 months, you actually have to rip it apart you will just outgrow it. You will outpace it. And designing for that context is actually, I think, can be really challenging. And so it becomes, ever more important that you are designing with these kind of North Star principles that actually can stand the test of time, that actually can stand different, sort of contexts of scale and, change and so on. And so then when you explain to people, like, yes, we are changing the program, but the principles are actually living on. This is the new way we're thinking about the principles in this new context. Like, here's what's changed. And I find that people are much more willing to accept these, kind of programs, sort of sunsetting and new ones rising and so on, if you're able to sort of link that forward. But also, if you then think about that in the context of building a legacy, again, any given program probably shouldn't live forever, actually, right? You'd hope that someone would come in and pick up the torch from you and actually
Yeah.
do even better things 3 or 5 years from now. But you also hope that they won't do a 180 on the things that, like, were really guiding you, right? And so
Yeah.
that, I think, really thinking through, hey, if you almost imagine your goodbye speech, right? You're like, hey, if, like, there's three things that I hope I can come back to this company in 4 or 5 years and still see to be true, it'd be like these things, that these are living on. And that then doesn't mean that it has to be this exact, you know, training program or this, like, hypo thing or whatever and so on, right? It just means that, like, everyone is living and breathing that belief structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I kind of said that was the last question, but quick bonus follow up.
Sure.
I find that it's sometimes easier to define and build these principles when you're coming in really early. Clean slate, company still
Mm.
young in its early stages of formation. But then there are some instances where the people leader may be brought in a little bit later in that company's evolution. And so I'm just curious if you have any tips and tricks around navigating building these foundational principles at a time where maybe the company is later in its evolution and how you've done that.
Yeah. I would not be discouraged if you're coming in later stage. I tend to come in actually kind of mid later stage, right? I don't never join a company before Series C, kind of context, right? And I think many people would sort of assume, oh, by Series C, probably a lot of that's cemented in and so on, right? But again, I think a couple things can happen. One is companies that are growing very quickly may not actually do all of those things that you think they would in Series A, Series B,
Hmm.
kind of earlier, right? Because they're just like trying to keep the wheels on the bus.
Yeah.
And then the second piece is even if they actually have sort of put some of that infrastructure in place, things change so much. And so you have more, I think you have more ability to suggest evolution and adaptation than you would at a more static organization, right? Like I think the thing, and actually the hardest one is when people go into these like, I was thought of a company and I won't name it, but these large static organizations that are actually doing just fine, their business
Hmm.
is fine,
Hmm.
reasonable margins, right? And there's just like there's no push.
Mm.
And how do you change that? Like I think
Hmm.
that's really hard. But I think when people's hair is on fire, even if there are things that they have known for a few years and they're attached to, right? Like I think there's more ability to kind of play with that. And I've been part of a couple different organizations actually where we had sort of an existing set of values or ways of thinking about things, and then we kind of evolved them. StitchFix, we actually did that. Gosh, it would have been probably like 7 years, 8 years in actually,
Hmm.
and we had a really strong set of cultural values. We called it our OS, actually our operating system, Stitch Fix
Hmm.
OS. But we, kind of relatively late in the game. We were, I think, at that point like 8,000 employees. We were post IPO, right? But we just said, hey, this is not serving us as well as it, an evolution on it could. And again, it wasn't a 180 on where it had been, but it was a 2.0. It was an
Right.
enhancement. And so, um, I think the team did. I definitely can't take all or even most of the credit for this, but the team, the working team that was around us, really did, I think, a great job of kind of getting out there and listening, and it ultimately really felt like a representation of what people sort of believe to be true, right? Though,
Hmm.
like, when we rolled it out, we kind of got the best feedback when people were like, "Oh yeah, this is actually what it is. This is
Mm.
definitely what it feels like. This is like when
Hmm.
things are working, like that's what it feels like. That language is
Sure.
so much better."
Sure.
So, obviously easy to say. Sometimes it's not quite that easy, but people definitely shouldn't feel like their opportunity is lost if they're coming in later.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, these things are always evolving, as you just mentioned, and oftentimes, yeah, that Series C, Series D, really, there are all these moments of transformation, and so I think that's really the best, most opportune time for a people leader to make their lasting impact and define what has really driven success up until this point. What is that going to look like in the future, and how do you build to bring all of those things out? So,
Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Square when I was there, he said something that has stayed with me, many years later. And he said, the best companies have many founding moments.
mm,
And it's such a great frame because the huge danger, particularly founder-led companies, right, is like like back when we were founded in the early
hmm,
days, and like if you're in the first 50, and so, then we wrote down the values, and it's all
yeah,
like, the glory days and so on, and the rest of you are just here to like, go to like execute.
totally, totally,
And for him as CEO founder to sort of say like, no, right, the best companies are going to actually continually have moments of founding
hmm,
that are just as impactful, just as transformational as actually the original moment.
hmm,
And just, I think both that sense of empowerment that can be true, and actually a sense of responsibility that if the glory days are you always looking back 7 years to the founding, like that's not good,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
You should actually say, wow, shit, there's like 5 other moments that are just as, meaningful in terms of really expanding this organization's impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said. Well, Jevan, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your insights and yeah, really digging into some of these critical themes that you've observed and also personally practiced that separate good from great. So always good chatting with you and until next time.
All right, it was a pleasure, Rasika.